Yeah, we had a really rich discussion in Group 2, which was focused on policies and enabling environment for climate resilient infrastructure, financing of climate resilient infrastructure. As you'll see as I go through the bullets, the discussion was extremely varied and touched upon a range of widely differing points. I'm not going to be able to do justice to the richness of the discussions at all. But if you have further questions or you want to follow up on any point, I can hopefully point you to the person who raised the issue in the first place. So it's a little small. Question number 1 was, what are the key barriers related to international, national, and local policies and enabling environments for financing climate resilient infrastructure in your country / region, city? We went everywhere, not just country, region, city. First of all, people identified that we really need interagency coordination, and there's a dearth of that, and that's absolutely a prerequisite for sound adaptation practice. And moving on from that, legislation that's existing pertaining to infrastructure is outdated these days. Building codes and standards for construction need to be updated. They need to be brought to code. They need to look at climate projections. And actually, going back to the previous point there on interagency coordination, ideally we shouldn't be looking only at climate resilient infrastructure, but also climate and earthquake, etc., resilient infrastructure, something that's more integrated. Coordination across scales is difficult at present in many countries, looking across national and local and regional governance structures in a way that can facilitate climate resilient infrastructure planning. Mainstreaming of climate change and budgetary planning processes, a lot more needs to be done in this area. It's an area that needs enhanced capacity. I know that at the previous NAPS meetings that I was at, organized by UNFCCC, there were a lot of sessions organized around that topic. It's something that's very near and dear to countries. Absence of climate information data and services, I think this is something Peter's group touched on as well, which was identified as a barrier with regard to, for example, enabling the private sector to fully participate, and they kind of really need those quantifiable informations at their fingertips. Risk-return disequilibrium, sorry, that's a very complicated economics term. I'm not an economist. I think to me it means that a situation where an investor is not certain whether it's really going to be worth their while to put money into a particular project. Are they really going to get returns out of it that are worth the cost that went into it? So that's another uncertainty / barrier, if you will, assuming I captured that correctly. LDC is perceived as risky investment areas. This came from an LDC, and it was identified by him as a barrier for private sector investment. Lack of sufficient / adequate project preparation funds to incentivize private sector engagement. Lack of awareness and leveraging ability of developing countries to climate funds. In other words, participants felt that there wasn't enough information out there about the different sources of climate finance and how they can access them, how they can fill the templates in, etc. Can we have the next slide? That one? Okay, that's group 3. Okay. Yeah. This goes back to the issue of building standards, lack of regulatory frameworks, governing progressive building standards, i.e. future forward-looking ones. And then somebody brought up the fact that a lot of our discussions today have been oriented around large-scale infrastructure, but for the highly vulnerable in small communities, small-scale infrastructure and ensuring that that is resilient is also extremely important, and we need to really bring that into the discussion. Difficulties in access to finance for subnational entities. We've been talking about countries accessing on a national level, but what about if we scale down? And then more flexibility and capacity needed in accessing climate finance. I think this came up before. IFI templates are complicated and inflexible. That is something I've heard before. Mismatch between private investment and long-term public needs. Okay, this is an important issue that was raised near the end of our discussions. the lady who was bringing it up said that private investment, the goal, the target, the reasons with which they invest in that are so different from what is actually needed for public infrastructure, and can we really get the two to mesh? We already came up with the integrated planning solutions, and then I guess we ended on a philosophical note with regard to the barriers, which is that we really need to, ideally, for a resilient world, make sure that all stakeholders are thinking about the common good. And that therein lies the challenge, I guess, for humanity. Can we get into question 2? This is kind of brief. Sadly, we had a lot more enthusiastic and forthcoming discussion on barriers than solutions, but maybe in the coming months we can flip things around. So question 2 was whether we can describe recent examples where barriers related to policies and enabling environments have been successfully reduced or overcome. And are there any lessons learned to share? Even though the list is short, there are some gems that came out of it, which is wonderful. So Egypt and Honduras both gave examples of cases where they said that formerly donor support tended to be not very coordinated, not aligned with national priorities and needs, and now they've developed national strategic plans for the kind of investments they need that are helping to harmonize donor support. Egypt has already put this into place, and Honduras has just begun a process, which helps to align with national priorities. Morocco has a great example of their strategic plan for road networks, recommending that an assessment of climate risks and resilience measures are undertaken for each project in the road sector. Colombia, there was finally a private sector example, which is, I believe this was an IDP initiative where they went and decided to learn what's actually happening among the Colombian private sector entities, given that climate change poses a risk to business continuity. So given those risks, what is the private sector doing to try to, of its own accord, to try to build resilience within its operations? So there was a great example there of a port that had decided to invest in solar to account for energy disruptions, to cover those. We had a good example from Russia of PPPs in St. Petersburg for flood protection. Another example from Belarus, again, with regard to renewable energy. I guess I won't get into all of these. The details are there for those who need them. And finally, another example from Morocco on the changing policies so that renewable excess energy can be sold to other entities and not just kept in the place it was being produced, which is a great example in private sector cooperation, etc. And as I said, I haven't done justice to it, but it's a starting point.